Welcome to our HVL Data Science Seminar series. Today, we have Professor Pierluigi Mancarella, who is a professor in Melbourne University and leading power system engineering group. And today, he is going to present running a net zero grid in 2024 experience from the Australian real-world lab. Thank you so much, Pierluigi, for accepting our invitation. And the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here actually. And as I was mentioning to one of you, I'm actually back to Norway after 20 years. I did part of my PhD at NTNU in Trondheim. So yeah, I learned reliability there in Trondheim, and it was a great experience. Yeah, Norway looks a little bit different after 20 years. Oslo is much nicer place now, so I'd say. Lots of good coffee, and it's my first time in Bergen, and it looks wonderful so far. So thanks again for hosting me. So what I'm going to show you today is a little bit of what's going on in Australia. That in terms of integration of renewables is somehow leading the world, and there are lots of interesting things happening on the side of the big challenges that we're facing to actually deal with such a deep penetration of renewables in a system that is relatively weak, not interconnected with other systems. But before I start, just let me tell you a couple of words about
Online version, we only see it, nothing but the presentation. Can you speak the slide?
what would you see in online?
Yours in this.
Ah, you seen the, okay, let me see how to do this. Do you know how to do this? I'm yeah, sure. Just to
screen.
Yeah, to share, and then no, it was okay.
So if we share this, then we maybe get
which. So this is screen 2 actually. Let me share screen 2.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, now it should be working better.
Now it works.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Excellent. Thank you. So tell me. Let me tell you a couple of things about Melbourne and university. I mean, it's one of the great cities of Australia. As a background for myself, my background comes really from UK. I was in Imperial College London and then the University of Manchester. Now I'm still part-time with the University of Manchester, and I'm now visiting professor at DTU in Denmark for 3 months. So I took the opportunity actually to visit a few places and colleagues, and some here. But my main headquarters really in Melbourne now. It's one of the great cities of Australia and the world, particularly famous for sports. If you're into tennis or Formula One, besides ski, I'm sure that you will know about Melbourne. And of course, it's a wonderful place from a different perspective. You know, just like I live there, and you know, there's got no comments. So in terms of the university, is one of the top universities in the world, #1 in Australia. Very proud of very diverse student community, pretty much from all the world really. And we are a relatively small group. Some of you know my colleague Nando Choa was an expert in distribution networks, and then we have also my colleague Glenn, who's our power electronics expert, and now we're growing. We're building a much larger group with 3 more people that are going to join us in the next few months. Now, let me tell you something about the Australian system. So this is the Australian electricity grid. It's a radial grid, looking very much like, you know, also Norway is radial, and it's probably much longer than the Norwegian grid. Actually, this is about almost 5,000 kilometers. It's the longest interconnected system in the world, and from a power system perspective, presents lots of very interesting challenges in terms of stability, particularly this area that it's at the end of the very long interconnection. It's the area of South Australia where there have been lots of interesting events happening. Here there is a little bit more information that can be pretty technical. What is really important to know from the power system operation perspective is that it's a synchronous island. So the grid is not interconnected to any other grids. So it's very different from the European grids where there is a heavy interconnection, and the interconnectors can actually help a lot the grid. So Australia is a huge continent, so it's an island. So everything that happens in the system needs to be balanced inside Australia. The other very interesting characteristic is that in terms of penetration of rooftop PV is basically the highest in the world, and so much that as I will show you in a few seconds that there are areas of the grid whose supply comes entirely from rooftop PV. So the entire demand of some regions is met by rooftop PV production. It's quite incredible. Now, if we look at the general energy transition, is it a technology problem? You know, many of you engineers, data scientists, we focus on technology, but in reality, it's not a technology problem because, and we know this since when engineers sent the man to the moon. I mean, that's anything that's got to do with technology, engineers and physicists, and everyone else can solve it. The problem is that you need to solve the problem within the ecosystem. There is a socio-techno-economic ecosystem that we have that's been built over the past 100 years. It's like very, very serious challenge to change it, to the point that many speakers, I'm taking here a statement by the former chief scientist of Australia, said basically the transition is humanity's biggest ever economic challenge. So it's not so much about the technology can be delivered, it's everything else. Now, as a part of this transition, worldwide, most countries, as you may have heard, talk about achieving net zero, let's say, or near zero carbon emissions. And how to do this fundamentally through renewables, so wind and solar energy, water for countries that are blessed with water, like of course Norway, and nuclear energy, where especially where for political reasons nuclear has been there for several years. If nuclear has not been there, there are lots of discussions as to whether nuclear should come into the portfolio to achieve near zero carbon emissions or not. Now we look at Australia, as I was saying, there are lots of discussions about running a system only with renewables. And when I say renewables, I really mean wind and solar. If you have water, it's a different case, especially if you have pumped hydro, there's a form of storage, then it's much easier to run the grid with water-based systems. The big challenge is to run it with solar and wind. They are, of course, highly variable and partly unpredictable when you do not have the buffer of storage and particularly water storage. Now, because of this, Australia has drawn lots of attention because actually the areas of Australia that are actually being run on wind and solar for large parts of the time. And for example, if you take South Australia, already 4 years ago, this area of the electricity grid, it's the peak demand is about 3-4 gigawatts, so it's not a huge system. But in times, for example, this was like a spring day where demand was about 1.5 gigawatts. The solar production was actually covering the entire demand, 75% of which was coming from rooftop PV, so energy really coming from our homes. Now, when we talk about net zero, somehow we're looking to try to balance the grid of renewables most of the time. And sometimes, if there is even just a weak interconnection, then you could also export energy to the rest of the grid. So when you look at the electricity grid, somehow what I mean here by net zero operation is really like balanced across the month. The net zero means different things when we look at the bigger energy system. But for here, for now, I really mean just balancing overall the grid with renewable energy most of the time. So this already happened quite some time ago, where if you look at South Australia, was basically powered by wind and solar energy for most of the time. And a few times when there was not sufficient renewable energy available, then there was some energy being produced by local gas turbines, or in case through an interconnector. There is a small interconnector between South Australia and the rest of the grid. Overall, across the entire South Australian grid, you have basically 100% renewable energy for the entire week. And once again, there is basically no water here. There's no pumped hydro. It's only wind and so on. This is quite extraordinary in terms of achievements. In fact, everyone is looking in terms of system operation to Australia, and South Australia in particular, try to understand how this could possibly done technically. Looking at many or much of the research is available. Nobody would think actually would be able to run a grid like this on paper. Then actually you can do it in real time. So when we look at a typical week, it's pretty impressive to see that it's exactly the future that we will hope for. So it's like during the day there is lots of sun, and then when the sun goes down, you start having lots of wind during the night, and you try to power the grid as much as you can with renewables. So this looks like the magic they would like to have, even without having significant storage. The problem is that this comes at some cost, which is effectively the way that the system operator is looking for flexibility to run the grid. Because as you can imagine, in order to balance the supply demand all the time, with the grid whose supply is, of course, very variable based on sun, wind, there are things that need to happen. And this is happening now in Australia, is effectively curtailing very significant amounts of renewable energy. In other words, there is a lot more energy from wind and solar that could be produced, that could be utilized, than is actually being utilized. And by curtailing this energy, then you can have the flexibility to supply the demand. So somehow this is looking good when you look at the glass up full, but when you look at the glass up empty, you say, well, we should do a lot more. It should be a lot better than that, and certainly not curtailing lots of renewable potential that otherwise, just wasted somehow. And when you look a little bit deeper, what happens here is that there are actually a number of very, very serious issues that happen in the power systems. That's got to do effectively with the new physics that we see in the grid. This new physics is effectively determined by the fact that we no longer have, well, besides, of course, the variable renewables are not powering the grid. So somehow the grid is weather-driven as opposed to fuel-driven as it used to be. Now, the other big challenge is the fact that the new renewable sources are no longer connected to the grid by synchronous machines, but rather by power electronics interface. And when you use power electronics interface, effectively you decouple the physics of the grid from what is happening from the physics of the machine, effectively because there's no more an electromagnetic coupling between the two. So everything that the old grid used to do in terms of self-stabilizing through synchronous machines that tend to synchronize with each other no longer applies to renewable energy sources that are based on this electronics interface. So effectively, there is no dynamics, and most importantly, no self-stabilizing dynamics with the new renewables. It's all control, which means that basically we need to design controllers that could somehow work very well with the physics or with the rest of the physics of the synchronous system that has been there for 100 years. So this is an incredible challenge when you try to do it at scale, and it comes with lots of consequences that somehow I try to summarize here. There's probably a lot more. And here I put picture that, I don't know, if some of you studied circuit theory, certainly you would have heard of this guy. This is Gustav Kirchhoff. So he's the father of electrotechnics, and somehow is overseeing everything that's happening in terms of circuit theory, but probably laughing now that we're seeing new physics come into the grid. Now, let me give you more than too much kind of physical explanation, because again, I realize that many of you may not be so familiar with the physics of our system. Let me tell you more about kind of stories that are happening in Australia to make a compelling case for a real world lab that wasn't in charge of my presentation. So when, first of all, there was like a blackout in September 2016 that I called here a textbook example. The reason why I call it a textbook example is because effectively everyone was waiting for something like this to happen, given that the way that renewables were being integrated at a very fast pace. In fact, when then I had to explain what happened, so I'm going to tell you the story why I had to explain this. Effectively, I used my teaching slides. I was taking the University of Manchester in my course of smart grids and sustainable electricity systems. I took my slides that I was teaching for 5 years to explain what had happened during the blackout. It says that, well, everyone knew that somehow something like this would happen. The problem is that then it is very difficult to do anything about it beforehand. So what happens at the time, as I said, there is a small interconnector here between South Australia and the rest of the grid called Haywood Interconnector. There were very, very serious storms over the South Australian grid. This is a pretty large area, by the way. We're talking about something like 500 kilometers. So there were like thousands of lightning strikes that brought down that night lots of power lines as well as towers. So with lots of towers and power lines coming down, you start having lots of dynamic phenomena in the transmission grid. Now, at the time of all these lightning strikes, the grid was running with lots of wind. 50% of the local production was wind. There were like less than 1/4 was thermal energy coming from coal and gas that were providing also synchronous stability to the grid. And then the rest was imported by the interconnector. So what happens is that at some point, much of this wind tripped off because of the protection mechanism of the wind turbine were not properly settings to deal with lots of different dynamic phenomena coming from the lightning strikes. So wind tripped off. So South Australia lost lots of generation. When you lose lots of local generation, because of the physical laws, then the power flows basically move across the interconnector. The interconnector got overloaded and also tripped. So when you trip the interconnector, now this area of the grid becomes an island, a physical island. But in this physical island, you only have very few synchronous machines to provide system stability, particularly frequency stability. That effectively tells you that you need to have as much supply as demand to maintain the grid operating as it should. So what happened is that effectively the system collapsed. The reason for this collapse is that the rate of change of frequency was so high. So effectively, when you have not so many synchronous machines in the grid, the frequency normally would be 50 hertz, can go down very, very fast. And the more power electronics interface you have, the faster it goes down, because effectively it displaces the synchronous machines that you want providing physical stability by so-called inertia that is present in the spinning masses of the power system. Normally, when we talk about frequency stability, we're worried about a rate of change of frequency that is in the order of 1 hertz per second. So the frequency going down from the normal 50 hertz to 49 hertz in 1 second is really something that we need to avoid. In the case of the blackout, the physics actually was close to the frequency went down to with a rate of change of frequency in the order of 6 or 7 hertz per second. So that's absolutely there's nothing that can be done when you have such a fast frequency collapse. So effectively, this is the picture of the frequency collapse that basically in half a second led the grid to disconnect and the South Australian grid to separate from the rest of the grid. Now, that's when somehow we're starting discussing very seriously new mechanisms to provide for stability services and introduce new markets for essential system services, including the introduction of new mechanisms for fast frequency response and inertia markets that basically they were never applied, never been applied around the world. So people were talking about it. People were starting writing papers about it. And now things happened, and these things need to be somehow applied very, very quickly. It's the interesting story there is, and I will not discuss like the kind of details, technical details, but the interesting story is that I had just moved to Melbourne basically 2 months before the blackout. And then the blackout happened, and the chief scientist was tasked by the energy minister to perform a study to understand what had happened in the grid. And then they came to university to ask who could do that. And of course, they said, oh, we're sure that there is this new young professor coming from the UK that can do it for sure. Nobody had a clue about it, including myself, because it was like, really, when there is a blackout, especially in a grid like this, is really scary. So I was tasked myself in turn to run this analysis and try to understand from the first principles what happened. And it was like quite impressive piece of work that we had to do and try to understand somehow the engineering of that. Now, following that, we showed in our studies what went wrong and how things could be improved. There was actually very nice, another very nice thing that happened, which is what somehow drives innovation all the time. As I said, technology is never an issue. Actually, technology very often is the solution. What happens is that there are great advances that happens in technology when there is a crisis. This was really a crisis because the crisis was not just for Australia, it was for everywhere else in the world. So if something like this happened in Australia, where we saw all these renewables, all this wind, all this solar energy, then this meant that it could happen anywhere. So somehow, if we couldn't fix the problem, then this could mean a lot for all other countries that were looking into renewables. So there could be like worldwide crisis. But in terms of crisis, the great innovation comes into play. And in this case, was the great developments that we had in so-called Hornsdale Power Reserve. That was the largest battery that was ever built at the time. So this was like a 100 megawatt battery. So before this, I think the largest battery existed was something like 5 megawatts in California. And then after an event like this, there was someone who came and said, I will build for you a battery that is 100 megawatts, so as big as a gas plant, a large gas plant, basically never built before. And not only will I give you 100 megawatts, I will give it to you in 100 days. Do you know who this guy is? Or said this? That's why it's called a Tesla battery. So on Twitter, like an Australian billionaire and Elon Musk started tweeting and basically said, I can do it for you in 100 days. If I don't do it, it will be free. So do you think he made it or not in 100 days? He did probably. When there is money, of course he did it. So he did it. The greatest battery in the largest and greatest, as I show you, battery in the world was built after the blackout by Musk. This created a huge innovation. It's basically introduced a new, we talk now a lot about battery. So without this, we will not talk about, because like one thing is to have batteries in labs, one thing is to have relatively small batteries, another thing is to have a huge battery in a grid that really needs the battery. So until you implement these kind of things, you don't really know whether they will work or not in real life. Now, the reason why the battery was effective is because it's like, if there is a problem with the frequency going down so fast, what batteries can do is they can inject energy at a very, very fast rate. That's what we call fast frequency response. So this is very fast injection of energy. Normally, power plants, conventional power plants, the synchronous machines, will also provide a frequency response when there is an event like this. But they take 3, 5, 6 seconds, 10 seconds to respond. A battery can respond in less than half a second. It's basically 10 times faster and can really help the grid when it can go into instability like this. So just to give you an idea, if some of you is familiar with the frequency control, and again, I appreciate you will not, but I think the picture will describe what I'm going to tell you. Well, you know certainly data. So what happens here is that which one is the red? So the blue signal here is a signal that the system operator sends to all generators in the grid to change the power output. Basically, they need to change the power output and follow this signal. Okay? Every 4 seconds, there is this signal sent to all synchronous machines. And this is the typical response in red of a synchronous machine. Basically, they're trying to track that signal. So every control engineer will think is not really doing great. But all machines in the world, all power plants in the world operate like this. This is a typical response. This is the best that engineers can do. You want to see what the battery does? I'm sure you want. So this kind of things, if you develop your small controller in Simulink MATLAB, this is the thing that you would be proud of to see in a simulation. This is not a simulation. This is the largest battery in the world, really performing basically better than a simulation. And this is the other picture. Is like, again, there is a signal that needs to be followed. But in this case, the signal to be followed needs to be mirrored, because it's a droop control. So instead of following the signal, it basically needs to be mirrored. So this is the frequency signal after an event, and this is what the battery does to follow the signal in a mirrored way. Again, absolutely impressive. So I can't explain enough how basically this kind of device has basically changed the way that we see power systems. It's like, you know, it's like the aliens coming, you know, from Mars or something. It's like you have like a bunch of machines around the world that have been there for 100 years, and then there is an alien spaceship landing on planet Earth. This is what these machines do. Of course, there are also other things that you can do. It's not only frequency response. They turn the battery into a huge attraction. So this battery is in Jamestown. It's a lovely area of Australia, and now the big battery has become a tourist attraction. This is me going on a road trip to see the big battery. It's quite impressive what you can do with technology. Now, this was one of the issues. So let me try to give you very quickly a perspective of what happens when you have lots of rooftop PV in the grid. So normally you have large-scale generators at the transmission level, and then you have the demand in distribution networks. What happens? You start seeing lots of rooftop PV, so lots of local generation in distribution networks. Now, I don't know how much rooftop PV there is in Norway. At the moment, you start seeing significant amount of local generation that is not visible to the market, because basically it comes from homes, then you can start introducing quite some issues. These issues are very, very noticeable when you look not at the picture of what the system does, but the picture of what the market does. I don't know how many of you have a market background, but effectively, what happens if there is a lot more supply of something than demand? What happens to prices? Prices collapse, right? If you have too much and nobody wants to buy it, they say, well, I can give it basically for free. That's exactly what happens with electricity. Prices are negative most of the time. We can discuss why prices are negative. It's a long story. But what does it mean prices are negative? That if you produce, you have to pay. And why is it so? Because there's so much local generation coming from rooftop PV, basically, that and there's other generators that need to produce anyway for different reasons, that effectively you have more energy that you need. That's why you curtail it, as I said before, right? For a long time, just curtail this energy. So when prices are negative, effectively all these generators would just curtail their own production, otherwise they have to pay. Okay, which means that effectively all large scale solar plants that were built are no longer making money. Because you built solar plants thinking that you could sell energy, but now you have all these rooftop PV that are producing energy. Basically, you just don't produce anymore because prices are negative. Now, imagine how happy these investors are. They built huge gigawatt scale solar plants and cannot make money because effectively they cannot produce. So when you hear things like solar energy becoming super cheap, that's not enough. It's not enough to have energy that costs nothing if its value is negative. So this is the case of very, very cheap energy, the cheapest energy we have on planet. These are some of the sunniest places in the world. So this is the cheapest energy you have on planet, cost-wise, whose value is negative. Why is the value is negative? Because you have too much of it. So this is the problems with the way that things are told in terms of how the transition should happen, right? This is exactly on the problems that we are facing in Australia. How would you fix the problem if you have invested into large-scale solar plants, and in spite of being very, very cheap, you cannot sell your energy? You just put into the ground devices that can suck your energy, and then so that you can sell that energy later on when actually prices are positive. And then you can do lots of other things with batteries as well. So this is it's somehow what we're seeing happening today, and it's only the beginning. Because if you look at Australia as we are now, this is the amount of renewables that we have, about 50% of penetration for the whole country. Then in some areas, it's basically more than 100%. But it is projected to go up till 2050 to basically multiply by 3 or 4 times in terms of renewable energy, mostly solar energy. Then lots of, so this would be rooftop PV. This would be large-scale solar. This would be wind. Then there is lots of storage, battery storage in particular. And then there is a little bit of other types of generators. The interesting thing is that most of this energy, either produced in terms of rooftop PV or stored by batteries, actually will come from the distribution network. But as I said, the distribution network is where lots of issues are happening, because effectively they're not visible to the market. So much of the work that we've been doing actually is oriented to try to create visibility of all this distributed generation effected by aggregation. And there are lots of projects that we worked on try to understand how we could aggregate and make generators, distributed generators visible to the market. So when we talk about particular virtual power plants, you have heard of, is effectively the aggregation of distributed resources to be able to play in the market and compete with the other generators. I will skip this, it's a little bit technical. I will want to jump towards the last aspect that is important for me to know, for you to know, from my perspective. That is other kind of physical issues that happen in the grid that needs to be fixed by the market. So when you look at a picture like this, so this is the typical system dispatch. You see lots of it is energy. And then there is a chunk here. There is actually gas power plants. And then there is a question there. When you look at this, all the, basically, the local demand, so this is zero. So it means all the local demand is met by solar energy. Some solar energy, some wind energy is exported by an interconnector. And then you have these power plants. And these are gas power plants, and these are the prices. So when you look at a picture like this, there is something very strange. And the question is, I'm actually answering to my question with another question. Why are these gas generators running when prices are negative?
The cost of turning them off and turning them on again will be bigger than the step with negative prices.
That's also, that's why we have negative price in first place, exactly. So all of this is correct. The main reason is that if you switch them off, the grid will collapse. Because now these are the ones still providing a few stability services, including provision of short circuit current, voltage control, things that you need in the grid. So it's not only about energy, it's about it's so-called ancillary services. And at the moment, only this kind of power plants could provide ancillary services. So even if energy prices are very low, you need somehow power plants to be able to run the grid, especially at times of minimum demand for the transmission grid, which now used to happen during the night. Now it's happening in Australia during the day, because there is so much energy coming from rooftop PV that the local demand is basically supplied by rooftop PV. So the transmission grid actually is very lightly loaded during the day. And because of that, you start having lots of, for example, voltage control issues in transmission grid. So once again, what we see here is a very nice interplay between the physics and economics, where its laws still apply, but we have old laws of economics that also applies and not so well. So this guy here that puts is Adam Smith, the father of economics, effectively to say that we're running an old market with the new physics. We need, unless we change the market, things don't make sense. You cannot have a market with negative prices and have the gas turbines running with negative prices, and then the system operator, of course, asking the gas turbine to run, and then pay off market the gas turbines to do that. This has been pretty serious to the point that in this area here, all the renewable, because of course, if you have gas turbines that run, it means that if you had the renewable production, it has to be curtailed. This is the consequence of having to run the gas turbine. There was an area here in North Victoria, this was Melbourne. So again, this is a pretty large area. This will be like 300-400 kilometers by 500-600 kilometers. So this huge area here was called the rhombus of regret, because in spite of having huge solar and wind energy, you had to curtail much of this energy because of stability reasons. So to curtail energy, have gas turbines running to actually provide system services. Now, there's been lots of research done that we're doing in terms of understanding what is happening here. And at the moment, the solution seems to be, in many cases, instead of having gas turbines running there, use a different type of synchronous machines, use so-called synchronous condensers. They're basically synchronous generators that do not provide, that do not supply active power. They only supply reactive power, and they can provide other system services. And you see here, the moment that a synchronous condenser enter in operation about 3 years ago, basically they could switch off one gas turbine, because now the synchronous condenser was enough to provide stability services. Again, this was the first time in the world that I saw this kind of operation with renewables. And now there are many more synchronous condensers operating in Australia, and all around the world there have been discussions about having synchronous condensers doing this. Of course, the problem with synchronous condensers is that they're expensive machines, and can we do things in a different way, maybe by controlling in a better way renewable generators and batteries that we now have in the grid? And the answer is, of course, yes, because there are lots of advances in terms of system control. Particularly, you may have heard this term grid forming inverters. That effectively means like providing stability services in areas where there are not many synchronous machines anymore, and many of the new batteries are actually being connected to the grid in Australia are now with these grid forming capabilities to emulate somehow what synchronous generators would naturally doing. The issues are pretty serious. I mean, this is a real headline. Electricity provider authorized to switch off rooftop solar in South Australia in emergencies. Now, do you know how many rooftop PV plants we had in South Australia? Well, you wouldn't know, but it's about 500,000. So how do you switch off 500,000 plants? What do you do? I mean, this is not a research paper, right? This now needs to be done. The reason why it needs to be done is because effectively, the problem is if there was you remember what happened in the blackouts? There was problems with faults and then trip off of wind. Same thing can happen to rooftop PV. They can trip off after a problem in transmission grid. But if they trip off, there's so much the basically system operator cannot deal with that. So the only solution is to avoid, to prevent them from producing at all. The risk of tripping off is so high that it's better not to have them produce under specific conditions. So this is the reason why it needs to be done. And this is a real thing. I mean, I think of this a little bit like a small vignette, right? Like, imagine the system operator calling, who is the system operator is Norway? Statnet.
No, the TSO.
TSO, yes, TSO, Statnet. Calling the network, the distribution network operator in Bergen. Who would it be? Yeah. So imagine this phone call and say, can you please switch off all your rooftop PVs? Imagine that you had 500,000. And then the response would be, what are you talking about? And then the system operator said, no, I am very serious. Because if you don't do that, we can have a blackout. If we have a blackout, I will blame you. So what do you think that happened? Engineers found a way to switch off 500,000 rooftop PVs. How do you do that? I guess this doesn't have anything to do with the papers, you may read about it, but it's got to do with brilliant engineering. So there is only one thing you can do in distribution networks at the moment to control this, which is you change the voltage level of the grid. Effectively, you go with the transformers you have in the primary substations, you change the tap, you raise the voltage of all the grid. When the voltage become too high, rooftop PVs have got protection mechanisms to disconnect when voltages are too high, and they disconnect automatically. So the local network operator raised the voltage of the entire distribution network. So the entire South Australia operated with high voltages for a few days, so that rooftop PV actually could not reconnect, otherwise it would cause a problem. It's quite incredible to actually think of what could be achieved in a very few hours actually. So this was so new that new rules needed to be written in the electricity laws to introduce a new type of contingency, so a new type of outage called indistinct contingency, which is the trip-off of distributed rooftop PV or other such entities like also wind energy. Because before, when we talk about, you may have heard the term N-1 security, say, well, you know exactly which outage you have, and you need to protect against that outage. When you have millions of rooftop PV that can disconnect, what is the outage? What is that one? What is the size of that outage? It cannot even be defined, and that's why it's been named indistinct. And if you cannot define it, you cannot protect against that. So somehow you need to introduce a new terminology in the rules, so the system operator was empowered to be able to develop like protection mechanisms against those outages. Again, quite incredible thinking about it. I will skip this part. It's got to do with hydrogen. Just to conclude somehow, at some point the grid, the operation of the market in Australia had to stop because again there was a risk of blackout. This was the time when there were very high prices after the invasion of Ukraine from Russia. The system, the market could not run because gas prices were too high, so the gas plants will refuse to run. The coal power plants could not run because the coal mines were completely flooded, and there was not enough wind and solar energy yet to run the grid. So the only thing that the market operator could do was to call the minister and said, you need to give me the power to stop the market and basically force the gas plants to run on what's so-called economic dispatch, which is not what we did. We used to do from a centralized environment where the system operator would basically determine exactly how much energy each power plant should do. So effectively, the gas plants were forced to produce, even when gas prices were so high, they would not make sense to produce. Of course, they were compensated, so it was lots of money somehow that was lost because of the very high gas prices. But it was the only way to do it, because otherwise the markets on its own will not be able to. So again, this is just highlighting the big challenges we're seeing, and now we need to reform completely the new market and security mechanisms to respond to what I call the new physics that we're seeing with so many renewables. And I mean, we have a number of exciting projects about it. One is a global center that we have started between US, UK, and Australia. There are 8 global centers that have been funded by MSF in the US, EPSS in UK, and CSR in Australia. And it's quite large projects, about 50 million. And we're working exactly towards finding the solutions in Australia is one providing probably many kind of problems to solve to the rest of the world. By the way, we're always looking for new people if anyone is interested in joining us. I left you also some references in case. Yeah, okay, that's it. Thank you. It was really just to give you an overview of what incredible work that we're seeing in Australia. Thank you.